Just waiting for him to sit down. Good evening, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Planning Board of the Township of South Orange Village, February 6, 2012. Jetty, would you please read the roll?
Sure. Mr. Brown, Mr. Colton-Max,
Here.
Ms. Foy,
Here.
Ms. Bauer,
Here.
Mr. Hutt, Mr. Miller,
Here.
Mr. Torpe,
Here.
Reverend Wilson, Ms. Guha,
Here.
Mr. Allen,
Here.
and Mr. Goldstein.
Here. Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231, PL 1975, this is to state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the public by posting and maintaining the annual notice of regular meetings on the bulletin board in Village Hall, by mailing the annual notice of regular meetings for 2012 to the South Orange Maplewood News Record and the Star Ledger in December 2011, and by filing said notice in the office of the village clerk. Everyone has a copy, I hope, of the agenda for the meeting. I must apologize, I was not able to make the last meeting. Apparently, the oath of office was administered to all of those for whom it was required. It is required that I have the oath of office administered, so even though it is not on the agenda, I think we have to take care of that first. So how do we do this?
Well, if you would, Mr. Chair, if you would simply fill in the blank with your name, you can read that into the record.
I, Harold Colton-Max, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same and to the governments established in the United States and in the state under the authority of the people. I do further solemnly swear that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform all the duties as a member of the Township of South Orange Planning Board according to the best of my abilities. So help me God. So I'll fill this out later.
All right.
Okay. So now moving back into the agenda, approval of minutes for the regular meeting held on Wednesday, January 11, 2012, submitted by Ojetti, Secretary to the Board. Any comments or questions, or otherwise I'll entertain a motion.
Move to accept.
Okay, motion from Mr. Goldstein, second from Mr. Miller. Ojetti, will you call the roll, please?
Sure. Mr. Colton-Max,
Abstain, I was not here.
Ms. Foy,
Abstain.
Ms. Bauer,
Same.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Torpe,
Abstain.
Ms. Guha,
Abstain.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
and Mr. Goldstein.
Yes.
By a whopping 3-0 margin, it has been still unanimous, it was adopted. Item number 2 on the agenda, approval of resolution for case number 216, applicant South Orange Commons 3rd LLC, premises affected 9-25 West South Orange Avenue for amended preliminary and final site plan approval. This item is actually being carried to the March 5th meeting. Is there anything that we need to say beyond that?
Mr. Chairman, we received a request from the attorney for the applicant that the resolution be carried to the March meeting.
I don't suppose anybody has an objection or any issue with that? Okay. Moving on, the next item is a board discussion of the proposed bicycle rack ordinance. I think it would probably make the most sense, Janine, I think you've been working most directly on this. Would it make the most sense to ask you, or would it make the most sense to have the chair of the ordinance committee comment on it?
I yield the floor to Mr. Miller.
Oh, thank you. We're getting the buck passed here, so.
Well,
You're up.
under Mr. Goldstein's chairmanship, we met at the committee for ordinances met after the last planning board meeting in January, and we had a number of comments on the proposed ordinance. We had some questions, literally. I mean, I think everybody has gotten a copy of the minutes that were sent out, and a rewrite at that time in my terrible typing of the ordinance. But we had a number of questions on it as to where it fits into the code, because some of the sections cited, at least in our reading of it, related to parking and not bicycle parking. And it seemed like we were fitting it into a parking ordinance. Plus, we had some questions on, it should not relate, in our opinion, to all multifamily homes, and we excluded, I believe, two-family homes. I'm doing this from memory without looking at the notes. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm speaking properly. In addition, we said, how does this relate to commercial buildings? Because this really relates to kind of mixed use or residential. It doesn't really talk about commercial. We were not aware of the grandfathering until a recent note came out, or excluding from that certain housing. And then we had a number of other questions, which I think that the memo literally to the boards, to the planning board spelled out. And, you know, such as we gave the township engineer latitude to approve bicycle racks rather than spell out, you know, it doesn't count if half of it can't be used and so forth. And we corrected some things, like we said, with just wording corrections within 50 feet of an exterior entrance or interior, as the case may be. So there's some cleanup that has to be done, and then we also suggested that we discuss it openly tonight,
Okay?
because we didn't solve all of the issues or all of the questions. And we thought we would get input from our planner or our township engineer.
Okay. Well, before we do that, as the chair of the committee, Ellie, is there anything you wish to add to that?
It's just one minor item. The ordinance was very specific as to what constituted a bicycle rack. And the problem is that with the growth of the use of bicycles, bicycling and bicycle parking, there are more and more variations in style where you can hang things from the ceiling or mount them on the walls, and that's one of the reasons why Mr. Miller referred to the idea of giving the township engineer the ability to make the final judgment as to what constituted adequate provision in accordance with the ordinance.
Okay, all right. Since you made mention of perhaps asking the planner for his input, I note that there was a document distributed by Paul prior to the start of the meeting. Paul, at a minimum, perhaps you might just want to say a word or two about that and offer any other insights or thoughts you might have.
Sure, yeah, I was just brought up to speed on this today. I took a look at, I believe, both drafts of the ordinance as proposed. What's before you, I just kind of went online and did a look at other sources for similar type of ideas. So what I want to, because I guess there was some question about whether 1 for 3 dwelling units was appropriate or not, and there were some questions in the subcommittee about whether they should include mixed-use buildings or other types of building types, other types of uses. So what you have here is, this is not definitive, this is just food for thought, you know, so if we had other questions on how other locales regulate this use. The top chart is from New York City. This is part of their Plan 21. They instituted some of these new standards. So they have residential and commercial and community facility use type standards based on the size and density. On the next page, I believe this is a mixture of the requirements in Portland, and in Vancouver, so your more progressive northwest type cities. And then the last couple pages were the ordinance standards that have been promulgated in San Francisco. That also shows you for both commercial and residential property, as well as parking garages and city buildings, what they thought were the appropriate scale and numbers. So this was just an idea that if the board wanted to, you know, how are other towns doing it? Well, how, you know, this is not I don't know of many other cities in New Jersey who have similar standards, but I think it's a great idea to start thinking about this. I think it's especially in a town like South Orange, where you have both transit and a very vibrant downtown. It does make sense to provide these alternative modes of transportation and storage for such. One thing I will note that I did read in some of the materials that were put together by some of the transportation policy institutes when talking about bicycle storage is that there are some bike racks that work pretty well and some that don't. And that the idea of having 2 points of contact are very important because you'll have bikes falling over, you'll have, certain kind of bike racks that may have been popular a while ago, might not be as popular now. Any bike where you have to lift the handlebars up and over aren't seen as being the best type of design. And any type where you have to do any kind of lifting, this is designed to be standards that any from 10 to 80 can still be able to use their bicycles without having to do any kind of lifting of frames and bicycles over their heads or over any kind of a large, they should be able to accommodate a certain number of bikes that the square footage should be about 3 by 5 because you want them to have enough room for the handlebars and not to be, we've all seen overcrowded bike racks, you know what they look like, and especially in the summertime, you're fighting to find a spot and after a while you give up and you go find a lamp post or a tree or something like that. So the idea is that if you're going to have, it is a good idea to have the kind of standards as, elucidated in the draft. One other note, whenever we have any kind of an ordinance, there's always a challenge between we'll let the market figure it out versus just tell them what to do, and it's easier and cheaper sometimes for them to just do it. If you tell them how to do it, then they'll be happy to find their best cost method for meeting that, rather than having to submit something and wonder if it's going to work or not, or if the town will be able to prove it. So I understand the idea for flexibility and allowing the engineer to just do what he wants in terms of approving certain types. But there is something to be said for saying that we prefer these 2 or 3 styles. However, we will allow the engineer to go ahead and make a determination.
Also, if, I don't know what the board's intent is, Janine, with respect to the ordinance. If they want it to be a part of the zoning section of the ordinance, and they want it to be a variance type of situation, then the standards will have to be tightened up because they have to be objective enough in order for the board to know whether or not it requires variance, or is it simply going to be design standard in the ordinance? How is it handled in those other cities?
Well, why wouldn't it be, I haven't thought about your question before, however, the proposed ordinance, it seems to me, is objective enough to know whether, we could repeat this standard in the zoning section of the land use ordinance, but right now this is just for off-street parking. We could definitely do that.
Is that what you think would work the best?
Well, the way it's handled right now, I had interpreted that as accomplishing the same thing, is to have the table, Schedule 3, gets amended, per
Standard.
the ordinance, and therefore that amends the zoning ordinance. Most of our zoning for things like off-street parking is by virtue of the table. You have to look at the table to see what's required for your
Yeah.
particular development.
In this particular
So
case,
I don't think there's any other text required, but I would leave that to you because that's your bailiwick.
the table is, in this case, the table for the parking standards is embedded in the text. It's not a schedule to the rear like we have for our use and bulk standards for the zoning. They are in fact embedded like we have with other kind of design elements right here within the body of the text itself. It's called out as a Schedule 3. It's 92-201A, Schedule 3, and the way it looks as if the ordinance is drafted is that we also have under 92-201 those letters B through E, which talk about multiple uses in the building, that must be provided on the same lot. There's additional standards. So in drafting these, I can understand why the drafter simply said, let's put a new letter F. And that would be the bicycle standard. So I think in a certain sense, it does make sense. And these are vehicles, and they may be smaller, they may not be automobiles, but they are vehicles. And it kind of does make sense if we want people to think about this and to kind of elevate this as another requirement for development. Maybe it does make a lot of sense to put this right in with our vehicle parking standards as well on site. So I do think, letter F would work just fine. It fits well into the existing ordinance itself. And it's really just a matter of, are the numbers right and are we happy with the language? I think it's great that they've included a definition, so oftentimes we don't see the definition added as well. So 92-3 is the correct section for the definitions for the ordinance, so that would make sense to put that in. And then letter F, I think, makes sense. I think that's the right, and in fact, I don't even know if we need to do Schedule 3. I think it could simply be 92-201F would be a new section under the parking. The schedule gets a little confusing. Just make a letter F under 201 and then leave the text, and then I guess that's when the next level of discussion would be, how prescriptive do you want to be, and do we think this number is correct? And I think there's a great question from the committee is, do we want to just talk about multifamily apartment buildings, or do we want to also include other types of development? One thing you could think about, often when we're looking at new types of, a whole new class of ordinance standards, a lot of towns like to kind of take some baby steps first and then expand their concepts. So sometimes this, multifamily apartments is a good place to start. You may want to simply say standalone or part of, a multi-use development, excluding senior citizen housing. I don't know. I don't know if you'd want to necessarily exclude the seniors if you wanted to. Depends on what you meant by senior. I don't know if we have any 55 or over, or if it just meant,
Well, you may not have yet, but at some point in the future, you might.
I don't know, every brochure I've seen for an active adult community, they're all on bikes. So, I wouldn't know how you'd want to frame that kind of discussion. But as you see from a lot of the other examples, things you could also include would be a parking deck. You could do 1 for 10 per parking deck. If someone is going to develop, that kind of a parking development, you could include a bicycle. That's a common inclusion, 1 per 10 or 1 per 15 in structured parking. And then as you see from the rest of these examples, they do include retail and office. A lot of, especially in office space, to encourage alternate transportation. You can, now, it can go, I think in some of the cases, I guess in Vancouver, you gotta have a shower and a changing room and all other kinds of stuff, and it's in their building code to require this. If you have more than 5 I don't remember all the metrics, but if you have more than a certain number of bike parking spots, you have to provide an area for folks to change and freshen up when they get to the office. I don't think the board's prepared to go that far, but it surprised me. But you may want to, these are some of the other types of uses that other towns have considered generating, a demand for bicycle parking.
Question?
Please.
To either our council or to Paul, for argument's sake, we have a mixed development, a mixed use, commercial and residential. Would that fall under the way this is written? Because it's coming under a mixed ordinance, and yet this is referring strictly to multifamily. So where you have multifamily and you have a commercial mixture, can one argue that, gee, I'm not under this ordinance because it's referring strictly to multifamily? And that was the question, I believe, that we kind of posed, and that's why we said at our meeting, do we want to extend, or should this be extended, and what was the board's intent, Board of Trustees?
The board-
intent.
Just to answer that question, the board's intent was to include all of the mixed-use development anticipated in town. So we'll just ask Steve Rother to make it clear that multifamily apartments as used in this ordinance includes those with commercial or retail on the first floor. Because all of our developments
In the
recently
CBD,
approved
yeah.
anyway, or to be, approved in the near future, I think are considered multi-use. So I intended to include them.
And so, as in parking, there'd be 2 separate triggers for the amount of bicycle parking. There'd be the residential unit, and there'd be the retail unit.
I'm not planning to ask the Board of Trustees to have any bicycle requirements for commercial or office units. I mean, I think we have a very small downtown. We've worked hard to put bicycle racks all around downtown at most locations, and I think that we can continue to do that. If you disagree with that, then we should think about how to do that, but I would say let's take time to put that aside in a separate ordinance rather than hold this one up. Just so folks know, we put about 6 months of work into this ordinance already. We examined a lot of, I'm sure, the same codes that Paul did today. We particularly looked at Philadelphia for residential and, higher-rise apartment building and where storage would go. We ultimately decided to adopt standards that were similar to Denver because we thought that was most, certainly different than, South Orange, but it seemed to fit in terms of what was reasonable to ask developers to do. And so a lot of the things that you're thinking about have already been thought about in committee. But we will definitely make it clear that the multifamily apartments to which this applies includes mixed-use development.
The other things that we just put in there to make it clear, so there would be no dispute, for argument's sake, the way it read before our comments is bicycle parking should generally be provided within 50 feet of an entrance. We said entrance to what? Well, we think we mean garage. So we started trying to clean those words up so that there would be no dispute as what does entrance to what? Because it could be the entrance to the parking area.
Or the building.
Or the building. So, I mean, it was just those kind of comments that we had.
So I guess the question is, Janine, what is what's the board's trustees' intention? Are they, since they've been working on this for quite a while, are they pretty comfortable with what's been proposed, and are they looking to move forward? As you know, this board has a recommendation to make. The trustees don't necessarily have to wait if it takes longer than 35 days for it.
Well, we have waited, so this is the night. Say your piece.
You want to move forward, in other words?
Oh, we're definitely moving forward. I mean, it's already first reading, and the next meeting will be second reading and public hearing.
Yeah,
And
the
we'll
only
pass it.
problem is, I gotta interrupt you, is that the first meeting, the board was under the impression that the planning board hasn't met and had no major comments when they passed it on first reading.
That's correct, because there were no comments that were made when it was brought up at the first meeting, other than Harold's request to exempt senior citizen housing, which we put in on first reading. It was then determined to be referred to the ordinance committee, and which is fine, except that I was out of the loop, which is really not a good procedure, to have me out of the loop for an ordinance that's going to come back to the board. But anyway, we can certainly accommodate this. That's why I would like to work through this line by line. For instance, in terms of crossing out the inverted U or the Cora-style racks, I would not want to have, as Paul mentioned, the engineer saddled with reviewing the design and style of bike racks. I think the engineer is very busy, and something like bike racks should be left to the discretion of the developer and his architect and designer. We've given 2 very good examples to use, and if they want discretion for another one, then they can come in for the village engineer to take a look at it, as long as it meets that other criteria. So I would prefer to leave that section of the ordinance as it is.
Janine, I'm sorry, the disadvantage I have in this discussion is that I must admit the only thing I have sitting in front of me is the email that I happen to have printed out that Michael sent around to everyone else. So I'm at the slight disadvantage of not knowing exactly what the original language was. What I am is, are you in the email from Michael? I take it that what you're referring to is the language that would be contained in section 2, where it indicates using the following standards, and then articulates the 1 and then A through D. And are you suggesting that those items should not be contained? I mean, I'm just trying to clarify. I just don't have the ordinance to look at.
Okay, well, I don't know if we can make copies. What I had the clerk do today, because the only email that I had was from Eli forwarded to Tom, which Tom forwarded to me, so I had the clerk compare whatever the comments were that was made by the ordinance committee to the original ordinance that was sent to the planning board and actually track the changes, because in the email that I got, the only track changes appeared in the heading to the ordinance, which, you know, really doesn't make a lot of sense. It was just to verify that it was in the proper sections of the code and so on, which the planner has now done, and the clerk did as well. So anyway, the clerk of the village created for me this tracked version, which is the only reason I know what the comments were. So I had assumed I was the last to know, since I wasn't forwarded the ordinance committee's recommendations. Now I'm hearing nobody else understands what the differences proposed by the committee are compared to the ordinance. I mean, folks, this can't be the procedure.
Well, in all fairness to the committee, and Eli can speak for himself, but let me just deal with design standards. It talks about design standards that it must meet certain standards, such as any bicycle rack design and style must be approved by the village may be approved by the village engineer if it meets the following criteria. And then it talks about 2 contact points, all of that. So that's in the revised. A full rewrite of the ordinance was sent. The committee looked at it and provided it. It was sent out to everybody.
Right.
Unfortunately,
I think that what Janine's saying and what I must admit I agree with, without putting, you know, I mean, it's easy. I wasn't on the ordinance committee. You did the work, so don't get me wrong. The problem is, without a sort of a, let's call it a red line version, it's sort of difficult to follow what the change was, because I mean, I can't put the 2 side by side because I don't have it, nor can I see in this what was actually changed. That's why I was asking Janine the question I was asking. You know, having said that, you know, I don't know that it's necessary, and I could be wrong. I don't want to speak for others on the board, but I don't know that it's necessary to plumb the depths of every single comma and whatever. I think it's the broader ideas.
Well, actually, there's
that.
in going through this,
Before you do that, Paul, can I just note for the record that we've been joined, in the minutes, so hopefully we'll reflect that we've been joined by Tom Hutt. So, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
it looks to me, in reading these back and forth, I have the version that was from the clerk's office, and I have the version that was included in the minutes of the ordinance committee. And from what I can tell, the first couple of issues were, for section 1 and 2, were just the pagination and coding. For section 3 under F, it was the inclusion of the excluding senior housing. And then beyond that, we just have that the addition of the word exterior to bicycle parking in the second full paragraph under F. And there was a difference in language in terms
Referring to that.
of racks must be installed so as to be fully usable to the extent to which their capacity is being counted, versus racks must be installed so as to be fully usable to their design parking capacity. Racks not so installed shall be credited with no more than half their design capacity. And then after that, they just struck inverted U-rack and Cora style racks, and they've left 3 essentially the same, with the idea that you have the 2 contact points, the 2x6, the U-shaped lock, in that they've added phrasing such as is uncomplicated, intuitively simple for the bicyclist to use. And the original has the, that's the original version, and they simply strike that language and simply put or other such arrangement as may be deemed acceptable by the village engineer. So we're really down to 4 points or 5 points, I think, of technical difference in terms of wording and description. Other than that, I think that's all the real, and I would love the ordinance committee to let me know if I've overstated or understated anything.
no, but you also wanted to include multi-use. This was strictly residential.
Yeah, I didn't see that in
That's
the, that was a question
Well, that was-
elucidated in the
well,
top.
That was a
It wasn't
question,
in
that
the-
was a question in your email.
It was a comment that the ordinance committee
I was
made.
merely trying to describe
Sure.
the red letter strike through
And I
type
believe you
of
want to include
version.
that.
Thank you, Paul.
We-
That was
we've
that was
noted
very
that.
helpful.
Yeah.
We've noted that, that's no problem. I have to think about the exterior bicycle parking, because quite frankly, it wasn't my view that parking be provided within 50 feet was only related to exterior, but I'll take that comment and think about it.
Yeah, I would actually think that if the, a lot of the recommendations are that they either be out of the weather or be sheltered in some way, that they're more effective if they're out of the weather or sheltered. So it may be easier to actually have interior spaces designated
Yeah,
for
I mean-
the storage of bicycles.
I think the misunderstanding here with respect to exterior parking within 50 feet of an entrance is this related to all the parking, not just the guest parking. Because remember, we have two types of parking here. We have the parking for the residents' bicycles, and we have the guest parking. So I think that's, in thinking about that and where parking has to go, I think that's just what has to be fleshed out, and I'll think of a way to do that, bearing in mind what the committee's recommendations are. The reason we had racks not so installed should be credited with no more than half their design capacity is because we don't want developers putting the racks up next to the back wall of the parking deck or something like that where, you know, you can't use half the rack. So we didn't want them getting away with something by, you know, jamming it in, and that's why we
Yeah, you need, like the
put
8-foot
some
clearance
kind
on
of
either side.
prohibition in there, and I don't think it does any harm. So if the committee or the full planning board doesn't have any problem with that, I would like to keep that sentence. I would certainly like to keep the inverted U and the Cora. I don't have any problem with the suggestions that were made to 3.
I have a couple of comments, Janine.
That's really it. Go ahead, Elon.
I guess, I don't think any of us took issue with the fact that every space that's counting should be accessible. But I guess we felt that by saying that, I think the way we interpreted the language in the original was that if you had a rack, let's say, that had the capacity for 20 bikes and it was put in a position where you lost access to one space, the way it was written, it sounded like you could only count 10 of the 10 capacity because it was not fully accessible. And so what we were saying is it should only be counted to the degree to which it's accessible. So if you put regardless of the size of the rack, if only 4 spaces in it are accessible, they should only be counted for 4.
Okay, well, the sentence currently doesn't make sense, so why don't we just wordsmith it right here? It says, racks must be installed so as to be fully usable to the extent to which their capacity.
Is counted, it should say, to which their capacity is counted.
Oh, I see. Is being counted, is that correct?
Yes.
Is being counted, okay, that's a little awkward, we might wordsmith that.
And then the second comment I had to do with the 50-foot. I don't think any of us took issue with the fact that the rack should be close to an entrance. But I think it's more complicated than that, particularly in multi-story buildings where, for instance, and we're not in New York City, but there are plenty of examples in New York in which the bicycle storage is in a basement and you have to put your bike on an elevator and take it downstairs. And then how do you count the 50 feet? It could be physically, if you looked at the plan, you could say, well, it's within 50 feet of an entrance, but I think the 50-foot dimension by itself may not tell the whole story.
So are you happy with the sentence as it reads?
Could you read it again for the benefit of everyone?
Exterior bicycle parking and/or storage should be provided on said property within 50 feet of an entrance.
Of a pedestrian entrance, of a building entrance, of a vehicular entrance?
An entrance to the building, yeah, it says.
So is it, if it's within 50 feet of a garage entrance, is that considered, is that what you were shooting for?
Well, are you only thinking of guest parking here? Because
I wasn't.
most of the developers are going to include the storage in the building or in the deck.
Well, let's,
For
let's,
residents.
I hadn't distinguished, and I don't know if Michael had either.
No, I haven't.
But let's just assume that's for guest parking.
Okay.
Then perhaps you should say
Entrance to the building?
an entrance, a pedestrian entrance rather than a parking, because we couldn't care less if it's 50 feet of a parking garage entrance, right? If it's for guests. What kind of entrance are we mean an entrance for pedestrians, or I don't know how you describe that.
Okay.
So I have a question. In that case, if it were a townhouse or a condominium kind of development, what would be the entrance of the building?
Perfect question. I don't know the answer. That's the reason why we're talking about it.
Is that a multifamily, building, Paul? A townhouse?
No, those are attached single family.
So it doesn't apply?
So it doesn't apply.
No, it's only for multifamily.
Yeah, 1, 2, and attached single doesn't seem to be under the,
And if this is it's mandatory, then I suggest that the language be changed to not, doesn't say it should be provided, that it shall be
Will be,
provided.
shall be.
Okay.
well, the first sentence under F does say shall. You know what you could do, really, to make this, you could say, under F, secure conveniently accessible storage shall be provided for bicycles as follows. Use multifamily, multifamily apartments, including mixed-use buildings, excluding senior housing, 1 for every 3 dwellings. And then what you could do is simply put, that would be F little 1, and then F little 2, you could simply say, design requirements. And that would be the bicycle storage, bicycle parking, and then the 3 types, inverted U-rack, the Coro style, and the other bicycle rack styles. You could do some numbering there so that it would be clear to the developer and the board that the number of spaces and 1 for 3 is the ordinance standard in terms of if you don't have that, it's a variance.
Thank you.
And then the other stuff that says it should be, how it should be included and how distance it should be and what the design of the rack should be, could all be design standards which would be subject to waiver if not fully complied with.
Paul, what about, for instance, the building, Sterling's building, that applied and came in as condos and then switched to apartments? The condos would be single family, so it wouldn't apply. But then they pulled it and then, well, I mean, you have to make,
Wouldn't, no.
well, then
Ownership,
you have to make the distinction.
no, ownership is not the distinction with multifamily, it's the unit type.
But
Yeah, it's
for
the
instance,
building.
but what about, for instance, the new ones that were built on Church Street that are set up looking sort of like townhouses, but it's really run as an apartment multifamily type of unit? You wouldn't put them there?
If it's attached single family, no matter how it's, we have to set, we typically in land use, we describe it about the unit type, not the ownership and or rental type. So if you rent a townhouse or you own the townhouse, it's still a attached single family. If it's stacked flats, it looks like a townhouse, but it's 2 units stacked flats, that's multifamily. It's, you know what I mean? It's where's the firewall, how do the units relate to each other? Is there a central corridor? Is there a central stairwell? Those types of things is how that works. It may look like a townhouse, but if it's not a single family between a firewall attached, then it's something else, then it's a multifamily. So it's really what it is. Whether it's a condo or it's a rental, if it's stacked flats or a multifamily building, that's how you would cover
So the
this.
facade could look like a townhouse, but it could be a multifamily,
Yeah,
which I think would apply to the ones that similarly that were built on Church.
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but then it raises some other issues, because what if the building has multiple entrances? Or do we care whether the guest rack is near the entrance that it's serving or any entrance?
I think requiring them to be there and trying to come up with distance standards gets you 99% of the way there. If they happen to be 75 feet from the main entrance, but only 30 feet from the second service entrance, we'll ask them, hey, can you flip it or not? Or does it make sense? And, I'm sure someone on this board or one of your professionals is going to say, all right, I'm a guest. How do I get from the bike rack to the building? Is there an intercom or not? We want to kind of lead them to the water, but let them actually drink it and tell us how they're going to meet. And, we've told them what we want. We've given them 3 or 4 options on how to do it. Let's see what they come back with, I think is a good way to kind of get into the, a good workable solution here.
I just have one other question. In section, well, I'm looking at the email. In section 2, in the first paragraph, under use and required capacity, looking at like the third or fourth line, it says that these requirements are only intended for prospective application for new construction and substantial rehabilitation projects. Just to remind me, what qualifies as a substantial rehabilitation project?
I think we want to call it gut rehab. You put a new roof on the house, doesn't necessarily mean, you know what I mean? I think if you call it gut rehab, you're pulling out interiors and refitting.
So what I'm asking is it changing the occupancy in some way? I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure out here.
Could I make a suggestion on that?
Yeah.
In New Jersey, for about the last 10, 12 years, there's been a code for rehabilitation called the
Right.
Rehabilitation Subcode, which defines all sorts of different types of work, which relate to your question. And one of the definitions is something called reconstruction, which is where the nature of the work requires that the building cannot be occupied while the work is going on. It's of such a substantial nature that you can't occupy it while the work is going on. So I would suggest maybe we could tie it into that and say reconstruction projects as defined under New Jersey Rehabilitation Subcode constitute substantial rehabilitation.
I guess what I'm trying to, I mean, that, I don't have any objection to that. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is I understand when you're talking about doing something for a new development project, but I'm trying to figure out the purpose of applying this to buildings that are being rehabilitated. Is it because you think enough work is being done that it can be accommodated without much difficulty? I mean, what's the thinking in terms of applying it to that as opposed to just new construction? That was what I was trying to figure out.
I think the answer to the question is that when buildings were built in the past, people didn't give much thought to this. People are giving a lot more thought to using bicycles for transportation now, and if there's a substantial rehabilitation, there's an opportunity at least for the developer, redeveloper, reconstructor to set aside some space to provide for that. It's probably in the basement, might be in a deck if there is a deck, or even in an outside, but shed or tent area or something like that. I don't mean tent fabric, but so it may not be able to be accommodated, in which case the person may have to come back to us or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, whether or not you want to put that in the ordinance, I think, is something that I would suggest that the trustees may want to deliberate upon. I'm not trying to suggest an answer, only to say that generally, I mean, in my experience, generally, you don't want to create standards, if you can avoid it, where variances are going to be required as a matter of course. And you can expect that it's going to happen as a matter of course. So if you think that may be what's going to happen here, you may wish to consider, maybe along the lines of what Eli's suggesting, changing the language and making it less likely that it's going to happen. I don't feel strongly about this one way or the other. It's just something.
But do you think simply inserting parenthetically reconstruction after substantial rehab would be enough to give the intent?
Well, I think Eli was more specific than that, and I think his suggestion was a good one, so.
Just tied to the definition of reconstruction and the rehabilitation subcode. And the other point I should make is that subcode, which relates to what Janine said, that subcode and that paragraph was specifically written with the same spirit that when you're doing that much work on a building, it's an opportunity to upgrade it, whether it's life safety issues or accessibility and so on. And so it makes sense to do it for the same reason, because here's an opportunity to deal with something that obviously wasn't contemplated maybe 50 or 100 years ago when the building was built.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts we want to convey to the trustees? There's no need for us to take any kind of official action.
Actually,
Is
Mr.
there?
Chairman, I would, and Patrick, stop me if I'm wrong, but I would make a suggestion that someone on the board move that they find that this, that the current draft is not inconsistent with the master plan. Give them a section 26 review making a finding that it's not inconsistent with the master plan, and as part of that recommendation, ask your board attorney in drafting that to include a number of suggested improvements to the draft. And I think we've kind of covered what those are. And either, myself or Ms. Bauer could probably help the drafter or to quickly list off the bullet points to be addressed as suggested recommendations on the final draft of the ordinance.
Okay.
When will the board take this up again?
At our next meeting.
Which is 15th?
Can you take over? Okay. Does anybody wish to make such a motion?
I'll move.
Okay, so we have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, I have a second. Jettie, could you call the roll, please?
Mr. Golden Max,
Yes.
Ms. Foye,
Yes.
Ms. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Hutt,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Torpe,
Yes.
Ms. Guha,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
and Mr. Goldstein.
Yes.
Okay, so carries unanimously. Thank you, and I think this is a very worthwhile endeavor. I'm glad you're working on it, and hopefully it will get done very soon, given all the time and effort we've all put into
I
it.
hope so. Well, thank you to the ordinance committee.
And thank you, Eli and Michael in particular.
Just a procedural question with going forward with committees. Since I'm the one that kind of got in a little bit of a ringer when other people were involved, and I sent minutes out to other than who was on the subcommittee. And I was told I can't do that. I could not send it myself to the entire planning board because that would constitute a violation of the Open Public Meeting Act or whatever it was. And so therefore, I mean, very frankly, when I did the minutes for Eli, I sent it to the subcommittee, knowing full well that Ms. Bauer was very much involved, but again,
Sure.
thinking of the
What I think we
admonishment
might
I had last
What I
time.
think we might do in the future is whenever a committee makes a report, to let it be known to the secretary and myself, and then at some point prior to the meeting, it'll be distributed to everybody. But there can't be an ongoing discussion about it through email.
Who distributes it?
Yes, the
Okay.
secretary. And that way,
Just to
everyone will have
stay out of
it,
trouble.
everyone will have it ahead of time, but we won't be discussing it as a board ahead of time. That's what we need to avoid.
Just so you know, the way the Board of Trustees is handling this now, because I don't think that's necessary, but maybe your council has advised you differently, but all of us get communications constantly, either from village council or from the clerk or from whoever, could even be a staff person. It's addressed to a particular person, whether it's a committee chair, usually to Alex or whomever, and then all the trustees are blind copied because you can't reply all to blind copies in Outlook. I didn't know that either. So the point is, that's like, a not so gentle reminder that you're not allowed to engage in conversation about this. But no one should be engaging in conversation anyway, because it was considered by the committee, that was great. It came up from the committee, that was great. I mean, everything was great. I'm sorry if I sounded scrappy, but, the bottom line is, there's these substantive comments. I didn't know anything about them, and I wanted to be prepared, and these strictures on emails sometimes work the opposite effect of what they're supposed to. So if you want to do it that way, if Patrick says that's okay.
I would think just the
That's what the
safest
board
way,
is
after
doing.
listening to Pat, everything is just the committee chair of any committee, just
Sends
send
it
it
to
to
the
the
Yeah.
planning
Okay.
board,
We-
SAC, and let them forward it on.
And we had done that in the past, I'm pretty sure, so I think that's fine. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Do we need to call a motion to adjourn, or can we just adjourn?
You want
Do you need to
hear-
ask for a public comment section?
I'm sorry?
Do you need to ask for public comments?
I don't
Yes.
think, generally, we don't.
A
Yes, we do.
recommendation on the 26th, so
Well,
it's not an application.
Okay.
It's not an application. But you can ask. Go ahead.
would any member of the public present here wish to make a comment of any sort? Well, hearing none, I'd like to see if I can get a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I see a motion from Danny, a second from Janine. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Thank you very much, and good night.